Hi, I thank you, Louis, for meeting with me to review the book Queer Trans Madness by Merrick Pilling, which just came out actually a couple of months ago. There's actually a book release party today at 3 o'clock I'm going to go to. So it's kind of fun to read a book hot off the presses. And part of the reason why I want to discuss it with you and hopefully make this useful for the Coyote podcast series was because I think that this book has a lot to do with, or has a lot of, at least intersects with the notion about decolonizing medicine. And so I'm going to sort of present what the book was about. And then I figure that, toward the end of this 15 minutes, that we might discuss ways in which it seems to maybe have some connection to decolonizing and maybe some ways in which it doesn't. So we can offer some critique. But so essentially, Merrick Daniel Pilling is a professor of women's and gender studies at the University of Windsor, and the book is published by Palgrave. And I did figure that just for a second, I would show at least the cover so that people have some sort of a reference if they wanted to look it up. Not that that's even necessary, but I guess I can't do it while you're doing it. But that's okay, I can show it at the end. But the full title is Queer and Trans Madness, Struggles for Social Justice. And essentially this book came out of about 7 years of work, which included interviewing 15 BIPOC, trans and queer folk who were people of color, and then another study that looked at what was called studying up, or looking at medical chart texts for analysis that were related to members of the Two-Spirit LGBTQ population seeking services in psychiatric care. And it's pretty interesting. I think the reason why this book resonates for me is because fundamentally the subtitle about the struggle for social justice, and this goes along with a lot of things that we've talked about over the years as a critique of psychiatry. But more about that in a minute. Most of the interviews were done between 2010 and 2012 in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and Toronto. And they were sort of pulled together during that time when the author had taken over a course about MAD studies, or MAD people's history, and taught that at York University. And sort of the point of it all goes to what one of the founders of MAD studies, Lefrancois, calls the critique and transcendence of what are called psi-centered ways of thinking, behaving, and relating and being. And psi-centered relates to the psi complex, which are all people who sort of accept, the center of psychiatric care or mental health services as they've, traditionally been organized. And the goal of MAD studies fundamentally is to give primacy to voices who have lived experience of mental distress, and then to actually purposefully sideline those who consider themselves to be expert at such matters, even though they don't have that lived experience, or at least don't own their lived experience, if you will. In MAD studies folks are sort of ill at ease with this notion about calling everything trauma, or referring, especially what psychiatry, as critiqued by Zaz, might call this chemical imbalance model, or there being some sort of biomedical deficiency within an individual. This all was designed, like I said, this book came out of these two studies that were done. We'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute, but the reason why I think that this has a lot to do with the queer, trans, MAD studies intersect has a lot to do with decolonization is because when you hear lists of things that are suggested in the book, I think that there's a lot of traction or intersect with ideas around decolonization. You hear that the traditional mental health, sort of research model thinks about lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and queer folks as being at risk, or uses what Brooks would call the minority stress model, And there's several other researchers who think about minority stress. But then also the problem of this is turning mental distress, or the struggle to sort of fit into what is the mainstream, as somehow biomedical, or somehow a medical problem that then is centered in an individual, as opposed to ever sort of addressing the more systemic issues related to that. And the biomedical model, that individualizes systemic oppression, as McIntyre and Gibson and several others have talked about, has always sort of been a problem. And then also the notion that because somebody is part of a special or unique population, that they automatically have some sort of vulnerability because of that is kind of it's a huge problem, and sort of seems to be structured from what came from originally. Like, don't forget that a lot of psychiatric or the state sponsored institutional interventions with people who have difference were about sidelining people who were different. And that certainly included people of color, that certainly included indigenous people, and that sort of a thing. And Pilling, from this book, has this great quote that I just thought resonated a lot, about something you've said. You've always reminded me, Louis, that you were always interested in people at the margin, the people who were exceptions to the rule, and that's where interesting things can come from. And so I think that it's really important that in medicine, that if we look at people who live at any sort of a margin, that they might have things to teach us about and reflect about the middle instead of vice versa. But the Pilling quote is pathologizing distress is not better than pathologizing identity. And so the notion being, of course, that being in distress in a society where it's difficult to fit in is perhaps natural, and something that we should think about a little bit differently than in a medical model where we try to provide medicines to people who are having if you will, a response to feeling different to the center of a society. And then one of my favorite parts about the queer aspect of this is that, one of my favorite definitions of queer came from Edelman in 1994, which is that queer represents sort of this zone of possibilities, that if you go back to the historic idea, is, somebody who's a bit different. And I tend to like people who are a bit different. And the goal is to challenge psychiatry to some extent in order to be able to embrace people who are different and versus pathologizing people who are different. So of course, talks about this notion of damage-centered research, and the problem with looking at somebody who is different as being damaged. And the mad queer trans lens is certainly grounded within a broad critique of the biomedical model, while looking at two-spirit LGBTQ folks and their dissonance as something that we can learn from. The biomedical model, if you will, if you think about it sort of tautological reasoning, it sort of says definitionally that if you don't really believe in the biomedical model of mental illness, then that might just mean that you're the one who's mentally ill. It's sort of like if you don't accept what the center thinks, then the pathology is within you as opposed to potentially within the center. And we also think about, the MAD studies movement fundamentally is about, as Lefrancois says, reclaiming disparaged identities and restoring dignity and pride to difference. So way back in about 2000, Richard Ingram is sort of credited with coining this term about MAD studies, which is again about centering MAD voices or people with lived MAD experience. And I think that is akin to the notion that that it's important that we look elsewhere for ideas and solutions in terms of addressing psychiatric difficulties and that we think about reclaiming the language and challenging most of how it is that we theorize about how it is that people have distress, so that we can better be able to resist that. And a lot of times people talk about, if the center is sanist, cis, heteronormative, racist, oppressive, is being on the fringe really all that bad? And there's a segment in the book that talks about the lunatic fringe, and maybe that's not such a bad place to be, given sort of what the center of it all is. And to never forget that a lot of oppression in psychiatry and medicine has certainly been racialized, from how it is that we've come up with treatment algorithms to silencing women's voices. I think back, Louis, to the time that you took the women in psychiatry course at the University of Maine, and you came back for weeks on fire about the history of all of this is not really that pretty. And this book sort of reminds us of that. And then it's also true that there's this critique, if you will. The first DSM came out in 1952, and in the first DSM 1 and 2, homosexuality was considered deviance, and it wasn't until 1973 there was a vote to remove homosexuality. But then they, in that same edition, added ego-dystonic homosexuality as a new construct, and then also gender dysphoria and gender identity disorder. So it's sort of like, even though some of the language changed, it kept central, what an embodied queer person might be diagnosed with in psychiatric circles. And Bayer in 1987 said that because of concepts of disease and health that are taken from and within cultural contexts in ways often that are hidden from view, the process of change through which certain deviations become normed or abnormal remains very difficult for us to discern. And it becomes clear only when historical social conditions permit, if you will, the piercing of the veil of what is considered to be natural by the center. So the Pilling book, I think, is important. So that, the first couple of chapters are sort of about that history and queering, if you will, sort of the look at MAD studies by looking at the experiences of queer and trans individuals, and centers their voices in looking at all sorts of issues that are outlined. What he calls imbricated struggles, or sort of the overlapping shingles, if you will, that make up the struggle against people who are marginalized and have been marginalized by psychiatry. And queer theorists, generally speaking, have failed to take up madness, or have done so at least disappointingly to Lefrancois or Diamond in their 2014 article that says that whenever somebody is individualized or essentialized or othered, then they are moved into what's called a non-knowledge or an absent space. So anything that sort of removes somebody's voice, or anything that sort of makes somebody or delegitimizes their authority about themselves, is something I think that we should probably be a little bit nervous about. Holy. And I just realized that that's 14 minutes. This book is fundamentally about moving against cis-centric or cis-normativity in terms of thinking about and centering MAD voices to make sure that those voices are included. And I think that it makes a meaningful argument about why we should consider demedicalizing and making non-carceral and non-state intervention responses to not just queer trans madness, but to madness generally speaking. Because as Eels and Pierce said in 2020, the violence experienced under the guise of people being, quote, cared about, cared for, or taken into care are just a few reasons that many disabled and MAD activists have since the 60s tried to renegotiate, if not reject, what are the terms of their care. And I believe that these are many things that are very similar to what we have talked about in terms of decolonizing medicine. So I'm going to shut up now because unbelievably that was 14 minutes. And now we can just have a discussion, and that will suffice as my book report, I suppose.
How long is our discussion?
Well, we can do a couple of minutes, I think. But I mean, let me just pose this to you. With this being sort of, your introduction to this sort of queer and trans intersection in terms of MAD studies, does anything strike you as having a parallel to your work with two-eyed seeing or decolonization? And if so, what would some of those things be?
Well, indeed, because we're looking at people who are different from the conventional norm. And the conventional norm, as you know, is pretty boring. And yet the problem exists that we create these hierarchical structures to manage people who misbehave in conventional terms. And we don't have alternative structures, I think is the problem. And that's what we're trying to do at Wabanaki Public Health and Wellness, where I work, is to create alternative structures for people in distress. And I don't think we care if they're queer, trans, anything. I mean, primarily we set out to serve Indigenous people, but I know we're open to non-Indigenous people. But so here's the problem. Regardless of where you stand on the marginality scale, if you attempt suicide, you're going to be taken to the hospital and you're going to be gobbled up by the psychiatric system. And we don't have another way of managing that yet. Or let's say you're shouting at your voices in front of the Gap. Well, that's bad for business. And so you're going to be taken to the hospital and become part of the psychiatric system. And I think Michel Foucault really hit the nail on the head when he said that psychiatry arose as a result of the bourgeoisie needing to keep unruly people from the front of their stores when the middle class was created in France. And,
Yes.
yeah. But so we have this problem where we both want to rebel from the system, but we're stuck using the system because there's no other option. And part of that has to do with money, that it costs a lot of money to take care of people. And so, and you can stop me if I'm rambling for too long, but so for instance, in Massachusetts, there's Gould Farm, which is an alternative place for people who are struggling. And in Vermont, there's a Soteria-like facility, an alternative facility in Burlington. There's a farm in southern Vermont. I'm blocking on the name of it right now. There's Windhorse in Northampton, Massachusetts. So the cost of these places range from $20,000 to $40,000 per month.
Right.
And conventional insurance and government insurance does not pay for them. And so what do we do? And I think that's the dilemma, that if we want to decolonize medicine, we have to come up with alternate ways of working with people who are in such severe stress that they can't take care of themselves,
Yes.
that they need containment, that they need protection. You know, I saw this happening when I worked in northern Saskatchewan, and the reason was you couldn't leave the community. There was only one way out, and it was by airplane.
Right.
And right, and so people would surround their relatives in distress and help them and protect them and nurture them. And in about 6 to 8 months, they, you know, these people would be back to their usual state of functioning. And it was actually quite inspiring to see that a community could treat people, could help people without psychiatry. And, you know, my job was just to sign their disability papers so they could, you know, have an income during this time.
Right.
But I don't know. I think that's our difficulty. You know, I glanced through the book. I didn't have time to read all of it. I spot read some sections, and I'm completely in agreement with, you know, the opposition to psychiatric diagnoses and all of that. That, you know, we need to be thinking about verbs instead of nouns.
Mm.
I just saw a tribal member Friday at the end of the day who had made a suicide attempt and didn't remember doing it, but clearly he had, because he was in the ICU. And he had been put on so much medication that he could barely keep his eyes open. And he was dizzy and uncoordinated and couldn't drive, could barely walk a straight line. And what could I do? He had a psychiatrist who he was going to see, you know, Tuesday. And I could wonder if maybe he might want to ask that person if the doses were a little high, which obviously I thought they were. But you know, there he is, someone who was relatively alternative and traditionally cultured, you know, immersed in his traditional culture. And all of a sudden he's consumed by the psychiatric system. And there's nothing I can do about it.
And like sometimes my critique of like a book like this or mad studies, although I think that increasingly as more writers from the global South and other places are writing about mad studies with a lens toward all of these things, that it's almost not enough to just stop at psychiatry. I think that one of my critiques is that it doesn't include A, the natural world, I think, as much as it should, and B, that it's not just about psychiatry, it's about the medicine, the medical industrial sort of complex. And because there are many diagnoses that aren't necessarily psychiatric or in the DSM, but like chronic pain diagnoses, fibromyalgia, now long COVID, like plenty of other constructs that have a huge psychiatric component. That there's a great example from the book about a patient, Shannon, who was struggling with chronic pain and fibromyalgia, but then the physicians decided that without asking, that this was a psychiatric issue, without consent, sent the patient to a specialist who turned out to be a psychiatrist, who then diagnosed her as borderline and somatic. And I mean, I don't know, like fibromyalgia versus borderline somatic versus just a mad queer woman. I don't know which one of those labels is more difficult, but I think it goes to your point about, you know, when the proverbial, if you have a hammer everything looks like a nail, if what medicine does is provide medicine or drugs, so that nobody's too excited, and hits every nail with those drugs, then without understanding the context of the patient, that is a useful use of, queer and mad studies, and I think, decolonization as a lens with which to look at medicine to go somewhere else. And we're
Well,
now at
right.
25 minutes, so we should probably stop this part and then just keep chatting.
Well, we could keep chatting for here. We could keep chatting for the podcast.
Oh, yeah, that's fine too.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that where we need to work toward is to say that people, to talk about suffering people in distress, and to have more phenomenological descriptions of their distress. This person that I saw on Friday, he was caught up in the question of what does he have? Does he have the bipolar? Does he have PTSD? And I said to him, it's not what you have, it's what you're experiencing. And you're suffering and you're experiencing distress. And we need to get to the roots of that. At which point he began talking about the conflict he was having with the mother of his son and her new partner, which was enraging him. And I thought, well, this is a more fruitful conversation than wondering what you have.
Yes.
And
while psychiatry will then say that he's not rooted in reality while it's sedating him, if you're able to have a few sentences conversation, you find out that he's firmly rooted in reality and suffering.
Right. And he's so rooted in reality that he doesn't like it and he wanted to exit it. I mean, so quite the opposite of being unrooted in reality.
Yes.
Yeah. And what I wanted to do with him was to work on finding other strategies for dealing with anger than popping, pills, taking a bunch of pills. And that's a big leap because it means going from the fast medicine to the slow medicine.
Right.
And so I started off, by wanting to teach him pranayama breathing, which is simply breathing out longer than you breathe in. I mean, not very complicated. And there's a free app for smartphones called Pranayama Free that I use with everyone. And you can, it's got beginner, intermediate, and advanced. Advanced is the longest expiration. But even beginner, you breathe out longer than you breathe in. And so I was showing this to him, and his response was to say, well, isn't there a medicine that'll make me feel perfect? Right. So pranayama breathing didn't go over well. But it's because he's been engulfed by the psychiatric culture.
Yeah, or as LaFrancois calls it, the psi complex. That, I mean, if you and I have lamented over the decade really about everybody who shows up who, like, the marketing has already worked. They know exactly what pill they want and in what dose. And I mean, to me, that explains also, I mean, why people get high. I mean, being high is a great way to escape your pinch of reality for that moment. And why wouldn't people want to get high? And
Well,
I think
exactly.
psychiatry is often a path that people take for that, frankly.
Right, because if you're, because like, you know, the medication can make you go out of your mind. I mean, literally.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. And I think you're right. And Gabor Mate talks about this, that all addiction is rooted in pain.
Yes.
And Matt Ball talks about dissociacosis,
Yeah.
that we enter into other dimensions when this reality becomes too painful, too distressing, too horrible to stick around. And so when that happens, you either attempt suicide or you enter into another dimension. And when you do that, we call you psychotic. But he says it's not, we shouldn't just say psychotic, we should say dissociacotic
Mm.
because you went there for a reason.
Yes. Yes.
You know,
Yeah. Ever since the DSM took out the list of ego defenses at the end, because people, you know, whatever, I guess they didn't sell drugs with it, but I mean, I will never forget that the you know, one of the chief ego defenses, if you're really in a disorganized state, is psychoses. But if you're in medicine, you're taught that psychoses is just simply a disorder of dopamine.
right.
And that sort of reductionist, you know, neurotransmitter talk. I mean, well, we could talk ad nauseum about that, but it's pretty reductionistic from somebody who's sad that they're not going to be around their kid.
Mm-hmm. And this is where Matt talks about inter-narrative therapy, because within narrative therapy, you enter into the world of this other dimension. And he says, you know, in essence, you go get the person and bring them back to this dimension by entering into the world they've gone to, and slowly bringing them back, you know, by finding better stories that about how to deal with this world, this reality. And you know, I mean, that's what my guy needed on Friday, is a better story for how to manage his feelings about, you know, his son and the situation in which his son was living, and this other guy, and you know, um, these things can be learned. There are stories about how to manage anger constructively, and you know, ranging from you know, Buddhism to traditional Native American stories to, you know, indigenous cultures all over the globe.
Yeah.
You know, we've all had to learn how to manage rage.
And I mean, to me, this relates, you know, to things. I mean, I don't know, people roll their eyes at this reference now these days, but I still think it has salience. The whole notion about, I mean, everybody needs their hero's journey. And, you know, I appreciate, I mean, all the great movies from Star Wars to whatever are about that. I think, you know, with the white lens, it's a little bit distorted as just the individual journey, but we certainly know that, you know, an indigenous philosophy that, I mean, there can't be an individual journey if there isn't really a community, and that includes animals, the spirit world, and everything else that we might be connected to.
I've got a story about that. Once upon a time, there was a British explorer who wanted to go to the North Pole. And he figured that he needed some locals to take him there. And so he went to an Inuit community and bribed them, in essence, to take him there. And so they started packing up the whole community. And he said, wait a minute, I just want the men. And they said, we don't do it that way. We would die if we did it that way. We take the whole community. If you want us to guide you, it's everyone or no one, because we'll die without everyone.
Yes.
Yeah. And that was so un-British way of thinking. Yeah. And really, that's what we have to do is create healthy communities. And I think that's really hard today in our settler capitalist society, you know, which focuses on the individual success, you know, individual, well, just everything.
I don't think it cares about individual success as much as it cares about individual commodification. Everyone needs a widget, the same
Right.
widget.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and you know, the new age psychology movement is full of roads to enlightenment, and and you have to buy a new one every 6 months.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. Which to me has always just said, it just means that they're selling us junk.
Exactly.
Man.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, it's a hard problem. And you know, I think Lisa Sakabason, the CEO for Wabanaki, has the right idea. I hope we can pull it off of creating space, protected space for people to be a little crazy.
Yeah.
And you know, it sounds exciting, and yet we still exist in the larger culture, the
Yeah.
larger society. We can't ignore it altogether, and we can't make people stay. You know, they can walk away and fall into the psychiatric system, get re-uptake.
That's right. Re-up taken.
Re-uptaken. Exactly. Exactly.
Well,
Yeah. I don't know. It's a challenge.
well, Piling in page 174 of his book in chapter 6 just talks about the problems of pathologizing survival, and hopes for the emancipatory promise of, you know, perhaps queer trans madness. And I would argue that that's rooted fundamentally in decolonization. And you know, he posits that, you know, just basically, you know, instead of dead naming somebody, like being careful, being mindful, actually listening to somebody instead of an algorithm, so that one might display skills like listening, respecting, agency, being supportive. Those just seem like simple requirements that are so easy to lose if you're in a system that has its own definition of everything.
Exactly. And as we've said before, there's no profit in listening.
Yeah,
It's inefficient for profit.
man.
You know, the contemporary psychiatric model is that it's all done by nurses and presented to doctors to sign off on the prescription. And that allows doctors to see a whole lot of people every hour. One facility, the physicians were seeing 12 people an hour. Seeing, I mean, they literally saw them.
Right. Seeing peripherally out of the corner of their eye as they go by. Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
I never, Noah Nesson once said that if he had 2 MAs, he could see 42 patients in a day for simple primary care problems. And it's in the decontextualizing of those problems from the individual and their context that I just think I think about the number of people that you and I have both seen in like psych observation units who were jarred for real reasons, but we don't ever get to the real reason because we're like bipolar, dopamine blocker, first choice, second choice, third choice, follow the algorithm. And I don't know, that's about as satisfying as a kick in the teeth, I think, but I don't know.
It's really, those environments reduce our humanity. They turn us into factory workers, you know, we're the means of production. We make the widgets.
Right. Well, and quiet the people who object to participating in the delusion that everything is just fine.
Right.
Oh, well,
Yeah.
I can't thank you enough for this. And maybe we should close this and then talk about our next meeting. But I appreciate this a lot, Louis, and I hope this is useful for your podcast and my book report.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you.